morning or afternoon. One of the critical missions of the Institute of Politics is to provide a forum for the discussion of pressing issues of the day. And this certainly qualifies. Whatever you think about Edward Snowden and his actions, and the adjectives range from traitor to hero, he has indisputably triggered a really vital public debate about how we strike a balance between civil liberties and security. And so we're looking forward to this discussion today, and there's no one better to lead it than our own Professor Jeff Stone, who has spent a lot of time thinking and writing about these issues and served on the President's panel after the revelations of Edward Snowden to think through next steps and how to deal with the questions that were raised. Another pressing issue today, as it was 50 years ago, is the issue of civil rights in our country. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's campaign in Chicago. And we are going to have an event on May 19th with some of those who participated in that event with Dr. King and some civil rights leaders of this day to talk about what happened then and to assess where we are today. So we urge you to attend that. Let's see. Oh, that's going to be at the Chicago Theological Seminary, right? Chicago Theological Seminary. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the introducer, Brock Huebner, a fourth-year student and a stalwart of the Institute of Politics. So we appreciate him a lot. Brock.
The documents leaked by Edward Snowden in 2013 exposed a massive National Security Agency program gathering vast troves of call records and internet data, both internationally and among U.S. citizens. Since these revelations, there have been few individuals more discussed and debated, praised by some, pilloried by others. Though accused of espionage by the U.S. government and labeled a traitor by U.S. intelligence officials, Mr. Snowden has also been praised as a patriot and whistleblower, finishing as runner-up in Time's 2013 Person of the Year award. Through his actions, Edward Snowden forced a conversation about the relationship between privacy and security, not only within the upper echelons of U.S. government, but also on online comment boards, day-to-day conversations, and on college campuses like the University of Chicago. Indeed, this was Snowden's ultimate goal, claiming in an interview with the Washington Post's Barton Gellman, quote, "I didn't want to change society. I wanted to give society a chance to determine if it should change itself." Already the subject of an Academy Award-winning documentary, Citizen4, his story will receive the cinematic treatment in Oliver Stone's upcoming film, Snowden. Leading this discussion is Jeffrey Stone, the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor here at the law school. Professor Stone served on President Obama's review group on intelligence and communications technologies. He also chaired the University of Chicago's Committee on Freedom of Expression. Please join me in welcoming Edward Snowden and Jeffrey Stone.
Hello, Chicago.
So welcome to the University of Chicago. It's good to see you again. I should tell members of the audience that we will have time for questions, so you should be thinking of questions as we proceed in our conversation. So to begin with, maybe a bit of biographical background would be useful. How did you get involved in the national security realm? What is it that led you to be interested in this? And how did you find this to be something that was a passion of yours?
So I grew up for most of my adolescence in the, sorry, there's a little challenge with the audio. It doesn't appear to be gated, so we're getting feedback through some mic and I'm hearing myself. But I'll do my best to talk through it. I come from sort of a federal family. My father worked 30 years in the military. My grandfather retired as an admiral. My mother worked for the federal courts, still does. In fact, a point of irony that I have not overlooked. And when I moved to Maryland, about, say, the end of elementary school, middle school, I was in the suburbs surrounding Fort Meade. So like everyone else who eventually starts going through high school and college and looking at, what are they going to do? I saw that this was just the natural direction of my life. Now, I had always been really interested in technology, or shall I say, sort of naturally proficient with technology. But I was really influenced by the claims of government, by sort of the mythology that's grown up around our country, and of course, Hollywood. So I thought, in the midst of the lead up to the Iraq War, when so many other Americans were protesting, I actually drank the Kool-Aid and I said, I'm going to sign up for the U.S. Army. Didn't go for the Air Force, didn't go for the Navy. I said, I want to try out for Special Forces. And they had a special program. It was very selective. You had to pass higher standards than you normally would at graduation of boot camp just to be selected for it. But I worked really hard and I got in. Now I got injured and I got pushed out. And that was a time where I really looked back and reflected on my life of what could I do? And the conversations that surrounded me were, well, you've already started on your security clearance because, of course, you're enlisted in the military. So why don't you finish that up and go into technology contracting for the IC agencies? And that was where I went. I went to the CIA, where I first worked as a contractor. While I was there, I was sort of talent scouted by one of the government employees who said, would you like to go overseas? And I had been, again, looking for that. And it just felt like it was something that I could do. A lot of other people in the office were like, I don't want to go. It seems like a burden. It seems like it wouldn't be, the kind of life you want. But for me, why not? So I did that. I rolled over to being a staff employee at the Central Intelligence Agency. On my first day I came in and I took the oath of service. Now, I will point out, it's not an oath of secrecy. In fact, no oath of secrecy exists within the CIA or the NSA. The oath of service is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's not a pledge of loyalty to the president, to an official, to a policy, or anything else. It's to defend the Constitution specifically, and not just against those outside, but also against those inside. But I didn't have any problems there. I went overseas. I served undercover for a number of years from a diplomatic platform. And then I came back and went back into contracting for the NSA now. And this was perhaps 2009, 2010, somewhere in there. And for a number of years, I worked, I worked for the NSA as a contractor in Japan for a number of years. Then I came back to the United States. I worked for Dell as the lead technologist for their CIA account, designing sort of supercomputers for building password cracking clusters and things like that. And then I rolled over to Hawaii after I developed epilepsy and was no longer permitted to drive in Maryland. And there, I really began to be exposed to a scope of surveillance that I hadn't seen earlier in my career. There had been things that made me concerned, but particularly with the election of President Barack Obama and his claims to really roll back some of the most extensive policies that we saw during the Bush era, I thought, he should be given a chance. And it was with growing concern in these last years at the National Security Agency, particularly when I rolled over in my final position to working directly with the tools of mass surveillance. Although I wasn't working terrorism, I was working counter cyber. That I saw that our public claims had become entirely divorced from the private realities of how things work in the intelligence services in the United States. And that, I would say, is really how the arc of my career in full began. So
you mentioned that when you joined the CIA position that there was not a requirement or an oath of confidentiality. But I assume when you took the NSA position, like other contractors or employees, you were required to acknowledge the fact that you had an obligation not to disclose any classified information to persons not authorized to receive it, and were aware of the fact that there's federal law prohibiting that. So what
yes, I'm glad that you brought that up, because the thing here is that, yes, you are asked when you join the CIA as well, and of course the U.S. military as well, if you gain access to classified information, you're required by this policy to safeguard it, and of course by some federal laws. However, it's a civil agreement, literally just a standard bureaucratic form like all of the others you fill out when you're being brought onboarded to these agencies. There are many of them, called SF-312. It's literally a standard form that the government makes everyone sign. So yes, of course, I recognized the importance of it, as did everyone else I worked with. This is a critical thing. We don't want people just taking all the classified they have and throwing it up in the air and just saying, you know, it'll all sort out in the end. That is a very valid concern. At the same time, it is not an oath. And this is where we start to get into the challenges. What happens when your obligations that the government has itself asked you to take upon yourself are in conflict with themselves? Do you obey the oath of service or the standard form 312?
So you reached a point clearly where you'd concluded that despite the fact that there are, as you acknowledge, federal laws prohibiting the disclosure of classified information to persons unauthorized to receive it, that it was the right thing to do to make a fairly large amount of classified information public. So I'm curious, what led you to the conclusion that was the right thing to do, and who did you consult in making that decision?
I think it's the critical thing when we start to get into this is setting out the context. Now, I wasn't new to the intelligence community. I'd been working in it for 8 years before I came public. Actually, I believe more than 8 years. And the thing here is that over time, particularly in the Obama administration, we were given the impression in the press that things were changing, that programs were shutting down. Again, the president promised to shut down Guantanamo, a thing which, again, he should be applauded for, but he didn't actually do it. Now, that's not something we can assign entirely to him because obviously there's Congress involved and other things like that. But particularly in the progress of the laws, the progress of the policies, the progress of the technologies that I worked with directly, and in fact, helped build and design some of these systems, a point which, you know, perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss later in the evening. But for me, it really came to a head. I had thought prior to this that there was something that must be done. But I hadn't gotten to the point of, should I light my own life on fire? Because I knew the risks. You know, we had seen other whistleblowers previously. Thomas Drake, now we see recently Thomas Tam, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis, many other whistleblowers who had had their careers destroyed for going through the established process. But it eventually reached a point where public officials were having conflicts within Congress, where congressmen felt the public needed to know the truth of programs. And yet the most senior official in the United States, General James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, felt comfortable enough in his position that he was willing to lie under oath.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
Now, if I could just make one point here, because I think it is important for sort of the timeline of how people understand this. And this was not public until quite recently. Laura Poitras, the first journalist which I was in contact with, was at that point communicating with an anonymous source who said, look, there are serious things going on in terms of mass surveillance. But she wrote in her journal that the source was unwilling to actually provide classified information to her at this point. He was willing to hint, he was willing to talk about the programs, but he wasn't actually willing to provide documentation. 10 days after that session in Congress, she said the source, which was me, had said they were ready to provide documentation. That, for me, was the Rubicon moment.
Remains the question of when it is appropriate for, with all respect, a relatively low-level official in the national security realm to take it upon himself to decide that it is in the national interest to disclose the existence of programs that have been approved by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, by the executive branch, by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and to decide for himself, well, I think they're wrong. I think these programs are not justified. I think they're illegal. And therefore, even though it might have serious effects on the effectiveness of the programs to make them public, I think the public needs to know. When is it appropriate to make that judgment, to override the decisions of all the elected branches of the government who've reached a contrary decision?
I think it's a really important question. I mean, this is one that I struggled with for quite some time. And that's why when I worked with the journalists, I made sure that I never had to make that decision. I wanted to remove from myself the authority, the sort of positional capability to publish any document on my own. And that's the reason why now we're sitting in 2016. I've never made public a single classified document. Now, what I did do is try to replicate that same system of checks and balances, which had failed in our government. Again, clearly, Senator Ron Wyden felt that he should have made, or that this program should have been public when he was questioning the Director of National Intelligence about, does this program exist, basically. We had seen earlier in that year, in February of 2013, the courts had an opportunity to assess the same thing and actually validate the constitutionality of laws, validate, sort of do an independent assessment of the propriety of these mass surveillance programs in a court case called Amnesty versus Clapper, which was brought forward by the ACLU. But they demurred. They said the executive branch was asserting state secrets, right? And courts, by long tradition, tend to defer to the executive when they go, look, it's a secret, don't get involved. And beyond that, they went, the plaintiffs couldn't prove that they had been spied on, which of course raises the question of, would the court have decided differently if the plaintiffs actually could prove, yes, in fact, we had been spied on. And the president and sort of the executive branch in general, of course, could have rolled back these programs, but they didn't. In fact, they were clearly trying to shelter themselves in many different ways, where they didn't have to take any sort of stance where they would publicly explain what is the value of these programs, what is the efficacy of these programs, and what is truly the necessity of these programs. And this, I think, clearly goes to the heart of the issue, which is that 2013 isn't wholly about surveillance. Now, surveillance is obviously a critical factor of it. That's much of what we've discussed. But what we're talking about here now isn't really about surveillance at all. It's about democracy, right? And democracies, right, our governments, open, liberal, Western democracies, tend to derive their legitimacy, their ability to pass laws, to rule, to enforce policies, on the principle of the consent of the governed. But as anyone in this room could tell you, consent is only meaningful if it is informed. So then how do we bridge that gap where the system does fail? And as you say, we suddenly have a case. The system has failed comprehensively. The only people who can actually write this system are individuals. But these individuals aren't all at the top level, right? There are, of course, senior directives and executives who could have done the same thing, but there are also people at the working level who can do the same thing. Is your seniority really more critical than what you've witnessed, right? There are many people at the top level of these programs who know how the policies work. They know every letter of the law, but they have never actually run a query through a system of mass surveillance in their life. They know the theory of how it's implemented, but they don't know the fact of how it is executed. And so for me, I recognize that I wasn't perfectly placed, as you imply, actually, as you stated, and no offense taken by it. I was not sitting, next to the table of the Secretary of Defense having this conversation with him. But this is why we have a free press. This is why the First Amendment is first, right? We need to have a truly independent, apolitical faction within free society that can challenge the government for control over information on which they will base their votes. And so I talked to the journalists and I said, look, I'm going to make an independent assessment of the documents that are available to me on the basis of the things that are known to me of what you need to know to make that independent judgment about the lawfulness, the efficacy, the propriety of these programs. I do not want you to publish all of these documents. In fact, I don't want you to publish any detail, any fact that you do not believe to be necessary and serve a vital role in the public interest for us to know about. And then further, beyond this, beyond my review, beyond the journalist's review, I required them to agree that they would go to the government in advance of publishing every story and give the government sort of a, almost an opportunity to do a sort of a negotiated injunction here, where the government would have the opportunity to review the documents on which they're based and make an independent assessment would these cause specific harm to any policy, any program, or critically, most critically, any individual? And in all cases, that process has been followed to the best of my knowledge, and the government does not dispute that. The only thing that is in contention is that the journalists, and these aren't just sort of radical journalists, we're not talking leftists or anything, we're talking about the Washington Post, the New York Times, said that in no case of the stories they published did they believe they put a life at risk. And that's why I think now we're in 2016, right? Not 2013, when it was quite reasonable to go, this could cost lives. This seems really dangerous. And in fact, it could have been. Now, I don't discount the fact that risks were involved in this, but the operation of a free press necessarily involves risk. Living in a free society involves risk. That is not a weakness. That is a strength.
So let me do a little bit of devil's advocate to that position, to point out that we live, as you say, first of all, I want to point out the First Amendment is first because the first two amendments didn't get adopted. So that's neither here nor there. The notion of a free press is to give the press a great deal of freedom. But in the democracy, the notion is that the people get to decide things. And one of the things they get to decide is they get to elect their representatives. And the representatives get to make decisions. Everything's not a plebiscite. And there are certain areas in which it's always been understood that there's a degree of secrecy that's necessary. So the problem with secrecy is that, on the one hand, it can quite legitimately further important interests on the part of the government. And it can also be used as a device for shielding wrongdoing or abuse of authority from criticism. And one of the difficult questions is knowing which of those two types of secrecy is going on in any given circumstance. And one of the reasons why we put in place a series of oversight over national security activities, which didn't exist before the late 70s, by creating the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, by creating the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, was to basically create a series of checks and balances within the government to provide a mechanism by which democracy could operate, not in the sense that there can't be secrets, but in the sense that secrets could be kept only if there's a persuasive case that's made to the elected representatives, to the judiciary, that secrecy is necessary. So there's still the underlying conundrum of when it's appropriate to make this decision that I think, or journalists who, journalists have self-interests which are not necessarily the interest of the nation, when they should be put in a position of making these decisions other than the representatives of the people themselves. Let me go to another point, though, and ask, what was the outcome of all this? So to what extent, in your view, has the law changed about these programs in ways that you think solve the problems or address the concerns that motivated you in the first place to disclose this information?
Well, as was said in the introduction, I think it's important to understand that I wasn't setting out to change policy. I was setting out to restore the balance between the governing and the governed, which has started to get a little bit out of whack. I mean, as you say, we elect representatives for a reason, right? But the only way that we can understand whether we want to re-elect them or support their policies, continue this, is if we actually know what they are, in at least broad outlines. Now, I'm not saying we need to know the name of every terrorist target. I'm not saying we need to know the name of every company we penetrated or whatever. But if we don't know at least those broad outlines, we're starting to enter a system where actually our votes begin to become ineffective. Because as you say, we elect people to represent us. But if we don't know what they're doing, and if we don't know what the other candidates who are their alternatives would be doing, what are our votes really doing? So I think necessarily there is a bias toward an informed public rather than one that's in the dark. Now, there are exceptions to this, but these exceptions are, I would argue, extraordinarily rare. When we're in times of total war, for example, U-boats in the harbor, we're already engaging in policies. We've rolled back civil liberties in ways that we would never approve of during peacetime. And we very likely should not in peacetime, thinking about things like Japanese internment. But regardless of our desires, in fact, we see the human nature they often do. these things become more clear because we're starting to talk about existential threats to the nation. Now, there are no serious officials, including the President of the United States, does not consider terrorism to be an existential threat to the United States. I think that's fair. But when we think about how this balance is done, and I think you're starting to get onto a theme, which is that, are we throwing open the doors if we allow whistleblowing to occur without punishment? If we allow people who are at the working level to reveal evidence of serious wrongdoing or policy failures, waste, fraud, and abuse, however you want to classify it, is this something that will very rapidly get out of control? Will there be sort of an anarchic rise of all of these low-level employees whenever a policy decision is made, saying, I don't agree with that, I don't agree with that, I'm running to the newspaper, and things will fall apart? Well, I would argue the record shows that's not likely. Because let's look at the case in the status quo today. Are there any cases of successful whistleblowers who have changed policy in the national security space, right, in this classified space we're discussing, who have not been retaliated against severely? Daniel Ellsberg was literally charged with treason for his activities back on the Pentagon Papers in the 70s. And this was, again, referring to a huge report. I believe it was thousands of pages, but something that was he was revealing after it happened. The information was a little bit stale. Despite this, treason, it was during a time of war. Technically, his life was on the line. The only reason he was not actually convicted was because of the government's wrongdoing. I think you wrote a book on the Espionage Act, and pointed out that there's often no defense at all against these charges. We've seen Thomas Drake, again, who is trying to reveal the Bush-era warrantless wiretapping program, which I believe you've spoken out against. And yet he was subject to criminal investigation. His career was over. He lost his wife. He lost his home. Now, rather than working as a senior executive at the National Security Agency, where he's drawing an SES level pay grade, for those of you who aren't in the government, the senior executives have an entirely different pay grade, which is, shall we say, very well accommodating. And now he works at an Apple store selling iPods. I would argue that there is enough natural countervailing weight against whistleblowing. There are enough counter arguments there that we don't need to worry about that so much. But I'm entirely open to being persuaded otherwise.
So the interesting thing, though, about what you just said is that you're right in saying that one needs a balance, that there are certainly circumstances where whistleblowing is important and valuable and justified. But there's also circumstances where you don't want it, where it does much more harm than good. And the question is how to strike the right balance there. So one thing, and your point is that, well, we don't really have that many whistleblowers because of the way we treat whistleblowers. So maybe that's striking the right balance. I mean, maybe the bottom line is to basically say, okay, we have to make these people suffer. Some people will have enough integrity, as arguably you do, to say, I'm willing to pay the price, because I think that's important for the nation, and they will blow the whistle on things. But if you make it painless, then you may wind up with having all these Tom, Dick, and Harrys doing it in situations where it's actually much more harmful than beneficial. So maybe we're doing it right at the present time. And that if we don't penalize the whistleblowers, even if they've done more good than harm, right, we'll wind up inviting too much whistleblowing, which will do more harm than good.
So that is a fair argument, but I would also say it's a very utilitarian argument, right? It's an argument without ethics. We're thinking about the ends without thinking about the means. Is it right to basically sacrifice people who are acting in what we're taking for granted in this example is the public service, right? Should we throw the village girl into the volcano to appease Pele so there's no volcanic eruption? You can make an argument for that. But there's actually, I would argue, a problem down the road, which is you've run out of whistleblowers very quickly. Whistleblowing is already rare enough as it is, as we've said. And in most of these cases, we see individuals who actually are bringing things of public interest. Now, the President of the United States was certainly not my biggest fan in June of 2013 when this first came out. He spoke at a press conference where he seemed quite uncomfortable. And he said, look, basically, there's nothing to see here. We've drawn the right balance. Don't worry about it. But by January of 2014, his position had gained an awful lot of nuance. By then, he had appointed you, and I believe a number of his peers, to write the report, Liberty and Security in a Changing World, which, by the way, I thought was excellent. But he also said, while he can't condone what I did, this has made us stronger as a nation. And so if we lose that, we're either losing opportunities for us to become stronger as a nation, or we're actually starting to face a countervailing risk of decay, where we don't have these natural whistleblowing events, which are basically steam release valves, right? Whistleblowers, because of the risks, only come out when the system fails comprehensively, right? I tried to work in the system. I went to my supervisor, I went to my peers, and they all said, you have no idea what you're getting into. You really don't want to play that game. Whereas Thomas Drake, for example, he went to the NSA Inspector General. He went to the Department of Defense's Inspector General. He went to the NSA's Office of General Counsel, I believe, and he went to Congress. He did everything right. And yet they absolutely destroyed his life anyway. And I think to contextualize this is key. For a moment, I'd like you to put yourself in the position of a whistleblower, right? Don't take my case, for example. Imagine your own case. You see something, you witness something that is so contrary to the values of this nation, to our black letter laws. For example, let's take the Bush era warrantless wiretapping program, which was what Thomas Drake was trying to blow the whistle on. And you try to fix this in the system, because I think this is the solution, right? We should have official whistleblowing paths, right? You should be able to work within the system in a way where you can get the grievance redressed, right? You can get the bad policy corrected. You can get the violations of law and those who have broken those laws held to account and remediated. But right now, when you go through that system, the government is not particularly, I would argue, especially responsive to that. The lawyer, the deputy general counsel, right, the #2 lawyer at the NSA, who Tom Drake came to his complaints with, said this.
He came to me, someone who was not read into the program, and told me that we were running amok, essentially, and violating the Constitution. There's no doubt in my mind, I would have told him, you know, go talk to your management. Don't bother me with this. I mean, you did the minute he said, if he did say, you're using this to violate the Constitution, I mean, I probably would have stopped the conversation at that point, quite frankly. So, I mean, if that's what he said, then anything after that I probably wasn't listening to anyway.
I take it what he meant by that, I hadn't seen that before, but I would take it what he meant by that was we weren't violating the Constitution. And we thought about this. We have lawyers looked at it. They said it was okay. So somebody comes and complains to us about it. I know better. So that's how I would interpret what you just showed there, which is not necessarily wrong. I mean,
but that's entire.
Yeah, I didn't like that program either, but that sounds to me like what he's saying. You're absolutely right. There's a much greater need in the system for review and checks and balances and so on than existed in the past and that exists at the present time. And there's also clearly a need for better avenues for whistleblowers to bring their concerns to the attention of people who have the authority to act upon those concerns within the system. And those are real failings that continue to exist. But I do want to go back to the question I asked earlier, which is, have the changes that have occurred in the laws as a result of your disclosures, in your view, made a real difference? Or are they just pretty much window dressing?
No, absolutely. I mean, we've seen the very first law restricting the powers of the intelligence community rather than expanding them passed in the wake of these. Now, again, these are the programs that everyone was defending in June of 2013, including, I believe you. This is, again, no disrespect, but it's just to show that even individuals such as yourself, who have come down very strongly throughout their history on the side of civil liberties, no one would say you're sort of an agent of the state or anything like that, were persuaded. You said, you know, there's nothing in these programs that we've seen that's illegal, that's unconstitutional. But since then, when we got that extra layer of review, right, once we take that NSA Deputy General Counsel who goes, look, I don't have time for this, I'm not going to listen to this, because we've already looked at this as lawyers, right? We're not just brushing this off. We've said, all right, this is constitutional. What about the independent review, the review that comes from the courts? Now, so again, in February of 2013, Amnesty versus Clapper got flushed from the courts. But in 2014, we saw the same cases that had been brought forward again by the ACLU because they were a customer of Verizon Business, who was subject to that very first document that was revealed, get them into the courts, and on appeal, they won. We had other judges who said these programs were illegal. They were likely unconstitutional. They were Orwellian in their scope. And of course, we had counter from other courts and things like that. But suddenly it begins to percolate up to the Supreme Court, where we get an actual matter of vital public importance. You know, this really shapes the relationship between the public and the government. Answered in what one would believe would be the traditional American sense. Because as you say, right, we've got the executive branch of government that's saying, look, we looked at these policies, we're comfortable with them. Fair enough. But that's not what the whistleblower is necessarily coming forward to do, right? They need to get this addressed by the whole of government. And ultimately, I'm no lawyer. You're the professor here. I was raised to believe that when we have those major cases and controversies, it is the courts that should be able to decide upon these. But the courts increasingly, because of sort of the overclassification problem, the reflexive assertion of state secrets privilege, they do not get to weigh in on these matters of what would be sort of critical public importance. And I would wonder, you know, is this perhaps, would you consider this to be another method of getting these controversies answered in a safer or more internal way, where we get public advocate organizations like the ACLU or others who can actually go before courts and get these things answered in a way, create some sort of procedure where, rather than the government saying, you know, courts don't have an answer or can't have any involvement in this all, except the rubber stamp FISA court that in 33 years said no only 11 times out of 33,900 requests. If we could get a real court, a normal court out there, an open court, that even in careful ways, you know, providing opinions in careful ways, could get to the heart of controversies without requiring individual employees to put themselves on the line like that.
So
perhaps ones who are not qualified or make the wrong call.
To the audience about the real regular courts, and the FISA court. Historically, the problem with having real courts, regular courts, deal with issues of national security is that those courts don't have clearances for access to top secret information. Their law clerks, their messengers, their secretaries, their facilities are not made for that. And so you can't actually have them address issues that are meant to be classified because they're not capable of handling the security issues. So in Congress in 1978 created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which was a special court consisting of regular federal judges who serve on a rotating basis within the national security realm, who act as regular judges for the purpose of being able to rule on the legality or constitutionality of secret programs. And it's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that is meant to serve that function. And one of the questions that Mr. Snowden raises is whether the court has actually served that function effectively. And I think there are legitimate questions about whether that's so. Let me ask you this. In what circumstances would you come back and face charges?
So I've already said from the very first moment that if the government was willing to provide a fair trial, if I had access to public interest defenses and other things like that, I would want to come home and make my case to the jury. But as I think you're quite familiar, the Espionage Act does not permit a public interest defense. You're not allowed to speak the word whistleblower at trial. That was in the case of Thomas Drake. And it's this kind of thing where, you know, it's a very popular criticism, right? That I think many people would innately understand and feel is reasonable, right? Why don't you face the music? But if the only tune they're playing is an unfair trial where you are literally deprived of the only defense that actually matters in the case, is that really something that we would consider to be in America's interest? Do we want to create sort of a precedent that dissidents should be volunteering themselves, not for the 11 days in jail of Martin Luther King, or the single night in jail of Thoreau for not paying his poll tax, but 30 years or more in prison for what is an act of public service. Now, the reason that Thoreau and Martin Luther King put forth this brand of civil disobedience is to put the burden across many members of society in a mass movement to create change that could not be ignored. If all of the weight is borne by a single individual, right, you can't build a mass movement because the first one to step forward is put in jail forever.
What you're saying is unless you can make the case to the jury that I was justified in doing this, and there is a defense of I was justified in whistleblowing, that you wouldn't come back. So why doesn't Congress pass a law that creates that defense? It's perfectly within their authority.
Professor, I would have to say that's a better question for you than I. I'm not sort of quite so expert in the intricacies of the Espionage Act.
But democracy doesn't seem to agree with you.
Well, I wouldn't say that's the case.
They don't, because they don't think it's a good idea.
Well, do we have them even consider it? Do we have them even debate it? Congress is desperate to pass so many laws today, you may have noticed, but they're not doing so well in actually getting any legislation passed. They're having trouble passing a budget. And now you're asking them to restructure laws that are 100 years old, right? That may be absolutely atrocious, that everyone in Congress realizes are just obscene. But at the same time, they're still focusing on getting that budget passed, right? There's priorities. But more generally, let me turn that around a little bit. Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think it's fair that someone who has done something that's done more good than bad, presumptively, goes to jail for the rest of their life for public service, particularly without being able to make a defense of their action?
The argument I would make as playing devil's advocate here against that position is that you don't want to encourage every Tom, Dick, and Harry government employee with access to national security classified information to think that it's okay for them to disclose this information. The benefit outweighs the harm. You just don't want people doing that. And therefore, you can't create the defense, because the defense creates more problems than it solves. That's the argument on the other side. So if you look at it not in terms of the justice to the particular individual, but to the systemic incentives it creates, I can see why Congress has no interest in doing this. Even if they're sympathetic to you, they may say, you know, we're going to create a lot more Snowdens who are not actually having the benefit outweigh the harm, but they think it is, and therefore they're going to do these harmful leaks. And we don't want to encourage that.
But isn't that why we have jury trials? Isn't that a question for the jury?
No, the jury only operates under the law as it's been established by courts or by legislatures. They don't get to make up the law. So the question here...
I'm not talking about jury nullification or anything like that. I'm saying if a law were passed, it's not a given. It's not taken for granted that suddenly you have this anarchic release of everything. These people still get charged, but now they just have a defense that they can make to the jury, that the jury goes, you caused more harm than you did benefit. No, you go to jail.
Right, but the argument on the other
same
side
as with manslaughter or self-defense, all of these other laws.
Right, and it's analogous to
What
self-defense.
is the exceptional act of whistleblowing that would make it unreasonable for a jury to weigh the same facts, the same harms as other crimes?
Again, I think the answer that one would give is that the incentive effects it creates are dangerous. Because, again, you have this problem of relatively low-level employees who think that they know enough to make a wise decision on this, and they're wrong. And if they're wrong, it arguably does real harm to the national security and to the nation, and you don't want to encourage that. So I just think the stakes are perceived as very great on the negative side. And that isn't to say I wouldn't be in favor of this, as that I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? But I think that's the argument on the other side. One, I guess, last question before we open it up to the audience. What's it like for you in Russia?
Strange. I have to say, though, it's also kind of amazing, because right now I'm not in Russia. I'm in Chicago. A few hours earlier, I was in Zurich, Switzerland, giving a talk to an IT security company. Tomorrow, I'll be at Princeton speaking with researchers, cryptographers, and technologists, computer scientists, to try to solve some of these mass surveillance issues that we're dealing with today. So while it is true, I do sleep in Russia, I live all over the world.
person?
I'm sorry, I lost the first part of it.
Do you get to walk around and be like a regular person in Russia?
Yeah. Of course. There's not like a wire fence with a guard and a tower or something like that.
And how do you pay for stuff?
I ride the subway like everybody else.
How do you pay for like lunch?
With money. How do you pay for stuff?
I mean, where do you get it?
I get paid to speak at many of these events, and I provide an enormous portion of it. I don't know. That would be a question for Ben.
I'll let you pass on that.
But I believe this is an unpaid event, particularly because you and Mr. Axelrod, I believe, who were, thank you, by the way, for arranging this talk. Mr. Obama might not be excited to hear that you are arranging paid talks on my behalf.
Well, with this, let me invite.
But there actually, before we go to the audience, there was one other question I wanted to go to you on because you've got a lot of expertise here. That I've thought about this before, and it's fascinating. So the premise that you put forth for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and this is not contested, is that we couldn't trust normal judges with it because they're not placed to handle sort of this sensitive information. But is the fact that we're actually monitoring this specific terrorist, they're creating this specific plot, we want to thwart it here or there, more sensitive, or even sensitive in a particularly different character, than it is for the police or the FBI to go to a normal judge in an ordinary court and say, we are tracking a serial killer who we think will kill again, or we're monitoring this burglar or this organized crime figure and things like that. Courts have handled extraordinarily sensitive material for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. What is it that makes this so different? And is it really different? Or do we take it for granted that the bargain we made in the 70s and have now tried out actually hasn't worked out, and maybe we should restructure it?
The assumption, I think, is that in the national security realm, where you're dealing with international relations and you're dealing with much higher stakes than in domestic criminal conduct, except in very rare circumstances, is that there's a need to keep secret your investigative methodologies and surveillance techniques, because if they're known, people can circumvent them. I mean, that's the key argument. The key argument is that if people know what we're doing, it's not just our American citizens who know it, but it's the targets of the surveillance. And once they know it, they can avoid it, and then we lose the information, and then we have terrorist attacks. And how true that is, how true that is, but that's the argument. That's I think the concern. The danger, just to go back to the point I made earlier, the danger is that that's not really what's going on. What's going on is the people in the secret world want to be able to do what they want to be able to do without having anybody else question them. I mean, after all, nobody wants to be questioned if they can avoid it in terms of their authority, and that this is actually an illegitimate use of secrecy in the guise of protecting national security, which is really in the guise of creating autonomy for people who don't want to be bothered. And sorting that out is a critical challenge. But let me turn to some questions.
Hi, Mr. Snowden. Thank you for joining us. My name is Matt Enlow. I'm a first-year student at the law school, and I'd like to ask if you would support efforts to access and disseminate classified information from the FSB.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who wouldn't? But if I could actually get back on, sorry, is there a follow-up?
Is the FSB, for anybody who doesn't know.
Yeah, apologies. Yeah, Chinese Ministry of State Security, Russian, FSB, whatever. If we have understandings of these organizations, particularly in more authoritarian states, I don't think it's particularly controversial to think that would necessarily serve a public interest. However, I didn't work for the FSB. I didn't work for the Chinese MSS. I worked for the U.S. National Security Agency. If I could get back to just one point about the challenge one more orthodoxy that Professor Stone, you put forth, which is very fair, of when people know that these capabilities exist, do they suddenly become ineffective? And I would actually argue, again, this is something that's taken for granted, just like we need a secret spy court to deal with spy programs. But when we look at the history, is that really true? Everyone in the room knows that your phone calls could be tapped, and they knew that before 2013, right? This has been in movies for more than 60 years. These programs have been public since the 19-teens, I believe. And yet, every day, we are still collecting evidence of criminal activity on open phone lines. We're still intercepting terrorists' phone calls, even though Osama bin Laden stopped using a cell phone in 1998 after Bill Clinton fired a missile at his training camp. And even Angela Merkel, as was published in one of the things, this is a head of state, is making open phone calls about matters of foreign affairs. The fact that a capability is known, I would argue, does not render it as ineffective as we might presume.
Hi, my name is Melissa, and I'm a second year in the college. Looking ahead to the 2016 presidential election, as well as the congressional elections, do you foresee any change occurring in the system you've been talking about?
We have already seen sort of the beginning of an effort to challenge or perhaps modify Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. This is a program that involves mass interception, but targeted reading, you would argue, of communications that have one end foreign. So one side of them is in the United States, other sides are overseas, and they sort of grep through everything with their tools and pull things out of the bucket. They also use it for going to U.S. service providers. There's a famous slide, I won't pop it up for you, but showing sort of Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, all of those guys, and the times in which they voluntarily joined this NSA program to simplify beyond what the law allowed, right? The law required them to respond to subpoenas and whatnot. But all of these providers created sort of boutique tailored processes for American intelligence agencies to go forward and get whatever they wanted. Now, if it's about an American citizen, they had to get a warrant for this. But if it's anybody else in the world, doesn't matter whether they're French, German, or something else, they're fair game without a warrant.
Hello, Mr. Snowden. Thank you for being in Chicago today, so to say. My name is Nico. I'm from Berlin, Germany, and I remember in 2013, your leaks and all these stories about the NSA have been on the news in Germany and in Europe generally for months. And I would say a large majority of the public there knows your name, and even more people are informed about the NSA surveillance systems. However, in the United States, I've talked to people even on this very campus that have never heard your name or are even aware of NSA surveillance. So how do you explain, or what's your take on these discrepancies between Europe and the United States?
So this is a really complex question. I'm not best qualified to answer it, but if you ask me to speculate on why that is, we have a broadcast media body in the United States that's very politically charged, it's very hyper-partisan, that goes in one way or another. And they pick narratives and they run with those narratives and they go with them. Whatever sort of draws the most viewership and doesn't destabilize sort of their commercial incentives. When we look at the portion of the United States public that gets the majority of their news online, we've seen polls that show they have greater familiarity with the NSA revelations and things like that. I imagine this correlation also exists overseas, but countries that were not the United States didn't have the same hero versus traitor ratings grab available to them because for them, of course, they're not Americans. They don't care about that. They don't see that as an issue at all. They're only focused on what is the public interest of this information. Whereas sort of the traditional broadcast anchors in the United States, they found, and we've seen this, I mean, I did an interview with Brian Williams where their whole lead was to do an online poll at the same time of hero versus traitor, hero versus traitor. They were not so interested in dealing with the controversies as they were with actually making their product, which is, you know, whether it's a news product, it's an entertainment product, whatever, it is very much a business.
Hi, Mr. Snowden. I'm Mark. I'm a first year in the college. I've got a two-pronged question. So the first is, do you have reason to believe that NSA has compromised either 4096-bit RSA or any of the common ECC curves? And for the rest of the audience, what are the consequences if or when NSA breaks strong encryption?
So the gentleman is referring to common encryption algorithms that are seen as very strong today. One of them is the one that's typically used by, for example, GPG communications. And as of the time I was at NSA, it was not broken. And the NSA doesn't even dispute this. I believe that as a form of asymmetric encryption using the RSA thing, once we start to get quantum computers that are actually effective in quantum algorithms that work on the search space, it'll reduce the security of it by half. It won't break it entirely. It won't break it immediately. I could be wrong here. I'm not a cryptographer. Hopefully someone in the room is, and you guys can meet after. But the second one about elliptic curves, there are real questions about how some of the elliptic curves, again, for those in the room who are not mathematicians, this is a very difficult math problem that we basically use to protect your information. If you can't solve the math problem, you can't read what people were doing. And the way we make this work for encryption is we just share the answer to the problem between the people who should be able to read it. Anybody who doesn't have the answer, right, who can't cheat on it, the problem's just too hard to work through. Some of these sort of initial seed values, we don't know how they were generated. So we have alternative curves called like nothing up my sleeves curves that were created in response to some of these concerns. So there are choices there. But in general, we have seen the NSA make efforts to break or weaken cryptographic algorithms, information security processes in products and services that are used in the United States. And this does expose us to a lot of risk. But we have a growing cohort within government and those who sort of support government and write reports on their behalf or share their expertise, such as Professor Stone here. And I think people in the room should give him credit for his report, where I believe, Professor Stone, correct me if I'm wrong here, you recommended in your 46 recommendations for the United States government in response to these revelations that the NSA not weaken encryption standards. And in fact, they work to increase the security of them. Is that correct?
That's correct, absolutely.
Thank you for coming today. My question is about what's your reaction to third-party portrayals of your story, whether it's Oliver Stone's forthcoming movie or my favorite, John Oliver, coming over, equating your leaks to pictures of genitalia. What's your reaction to that? Did you expect to become a celebrity in this way?
You know, it's really funny. If you go back to June 2013, you know, I was very forceful in my first interviews. And I said, look, guys, stop talking about me. Talk about the NSA. I am the least important part of the story here. But again, when we get into how does media sell attention, right? How do they get, or sorry, how do they buy attention? How do they actually get you to watch things? People care about characters for whatever reason. You know, just our biology, our brains, the way we relate to things is about character stories. So they simply would not let me go. I was hoping so hard that, you know, we would get some other figurehead, somebody to stand up and start talking about them who didn't have the common criticisms against their character that I do, right? Because regardless of how you feel about me, there are people who dislike me, right? There are people who disapprove of what I did. If we could divorce that from the narrative, that would be extraordinarily helpful. But we didn't see it happen. At least the media didn't have an interest in it. At this point now, 3 years down the road, the way I look at it is these different portrayals and these different third-party things, I don't care how they want to talk about me, as long as they're getting people interested in the matters of governance, democracy, and security for our communications around the world. Talking about, you know, what the world is today in the status quo, but more importantly, what kind of world do we want to live in? I don't care how they do it. And I think it's a great thing that we, at least as the public, can have those conversations. I think it's great that in the United States, we don't have, hopefully, secret services that are kicking in the doors and shredding hard drives of journalists like they did in the United Kingdom, or God knows, more authoritarian countries are doing all the time. So, you know, I guess I kind of rambled there, but I would say, look, you know, one of the weird things about being thrust into these positions where everybody's talking about you is about 80% of it's wrong, right? And you just pray for the 5% they get right.
Hi there, I'm Lily. I'm a first year in the college. So I found it very interesting that in a recent article you wrote, you encourage people to whistleblow only if they feel like it's the right moment. So how do people know when it's the right moment, and how much of the attention you received in 2013 would you attribute to good timing?
That's a really good question. In fact, I think I missed my moment. I think had I had a better understanding of these programs earlier on, had I understand sort of the nature of that Senate Intelligence Committee relationship with the Director of National Intelligence, where he was totally comfortable, you know, giving false testimony when he had sworn an oath. I should have come forward when people could have actually talked about this during the election. But at the same time, it has worked extraordinarily well. Ultimately, the fact that so many people do know about this, and the fact that our government has changed its policies, its positions comprehensively across the board. Again, prior to June 2013, everybody was defending these programs. Everybody was supporting these programs without change. Since then, we've seen the president put forth new changes, new executive orders. Again, they're not the reform we need, but it's a start, right, which is important. We have seen the Congress pass new laws in response. We have seen the courts consider these questions. We have seen consider these questions and, again, actually find these laws unconstitutional, saying they had never been authorized by statute from the beginning of their operation. We have seen the United Nations declare mass surveillance of exactly the character we've been discussing today. And of course, this is not specific to the United States. This is a global problem. We're dealing with this in many countries. Is a violation of human rights. We have seen the European Court of Justice strike down the Data Retention Directive, which was a mass surveillance sort of mandate where you had to log all of the access of your citizenry, like every website they touched and things like that, every phone call they made and so on and so forth. And it just goes on and on and on. I mean, I can't actually give these things with the times that we have available. But more than anything else, we know about it, right? Not everybody has to care about every issue, right? Not everything is the most important thing in the world, but the fact that we can assess these for ourselves, we can make informed decisions about how we want to communicate, how we want to protect against the sort of depredations of people using groups who have access to these technologies. And also, ultimately, what we want to advocate for, what we want to campaign for, the kind of candidates that we want to support to actually get the kind of reform we need when we cast our vote. That's a win. I apologize. It looks like you've lost my video feed, so I'll go on audio.
Okay. Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm getting my master's in social science here, and I was reading a story that was saying how Henry Kissinger on Monday received an award from the Department of Defense, and you could make the argument that he was a party to government misdoings. And so I guess my question is, what do you see is the role of a whistleblower in calling out individuals that are party to that kind of government abuse? And does pointing out individuals strengthen the argument, or does it just create scapegoats when you're really trying to target the government entity itself?
Well, actually, if I could defer this one to you, Professor Stone, at least for a first take on it, given that you have the concerns about how this grows into a practice and the potential concerns, how would you feel about that?
I am embarrassed to say that I've been looking at the screen and trying to figure out when the picture is going to come back, and I did not listen to the question.
I apologize.
No, I feel like a student in class who just got called on when I was looking at my iPhone.
Okay. We all have a finite amount of attention, right? Could you repeat the question for the professor?
Can you repeat it? Yeah.
No problem. Basically, when a whistleblower comes forward, what do you see as their role in pointing out individuals that are party to the system? Does it heighten by creating examples and really making it tangible for individuals, or does it seem to undermine the entire system that whistleblowers are trying to point out by creating a scapegoat?
The scapegoat meaning other people they identify?
More that the government can point to an individual's wrongdoing than taking responsibility that the whistleblower is trying to point out.
So I guess the question is, to what extent does the focus on the issue of the whistleblower divert attention from the substantive question that's been raised? So we're all sitting here today talking with Edward Snowden about Edward Snowden. If we had an event today about the substantive issues that Mr. Snowden raised, my guess is we would not have nearly the demand in the audience that we have here. So now the question is whether that diversion takes attention away from the substantive issue, or whether people are actually much more interested in the celebrity than the substantive issue. And I think probably both are true. But I have no doubt that I know we had huge demand for this event, so we could watch Mr. Snowden up on a video screen. And I have no doubt if I were having this conversation here about the very same issues that Mr. Snowden raised, that the vast majority of students who wanted to attend this event wouldn't be here. But I don't know if that's a negative thing. I think it's just the two different elements of it. There's an interest in the substance, and there's an interest in the celebrity, and they don't, I think, take away from each other. Sure.
And if I could just follow on that real quick, I do think there's actually a peripheral issue that's a little bit different, which is if we get a lot of whistleblowers who are focused on individuals' criminalities, right, rather than programmatic wrongdoing, whistleblowing can start, or at least the individual acts of it, can start to look partisan. It can start to look like this is actually about people you don't like or trying to get your boss out of his chair so you can occupy it, as was the case with Mark Felt, I believe, the deep throat back in the Watergate era. Although we don't know for sure that that's one of the sort of leading theories. It's more helpful when we actually start to focus again on the programmatic things. Now, as Mr. Stone said, can you draw the same crowd when you don't have the individual story? I'm not sure. I tried my best, but they wouldn't really let go. One last point. If technologically we can restore the video if we just reset the call right now, I'm not sure if the audio room is prepared to do that. If they are, we can do that. Otherwise, we can just forge ahead with audio only right now. Can we get the next question in the meantime while they decide?
Hi, Mr. Snowden. My name is Isabel Dybel. I'm a first year in the college, and my question actually works nicely with that last point you were making. I'd like to talk about the path that you mentioned a little bit earlier for whistleblowers in the government. And I'm wondering if you foresee any sort of problems with partisanship, with politics, if that path could be abused by any sort of government official to use that path for their own political soapbox and to abuse it, taking away the spotlight from the heart of the issue and focusing it on the politics of whatever that government official may be viewing. Do you foresee any sort of problems if that path were to be set up?
Yeah, so this creates actually, or starts to get at a very serious problem, which has not been discussed at all publicly in any substantive way, at least in the open side. Professor Stone may have seen some of this when they were talking internally around the White House and related agencies. But regardless of what you think about me, regardless of if what I did was the right thing or the wrong thing, what does it mean that a 29-year-old contractor could walk into the NSA, walk out with what the government contends is an unknowable number of files, provide these to journalists in secret, and the government doesn't know about it until this individual is sitting down in the room with the journalists? What if that individual or a similar individual weren't going to the press? What if they weren't interested in the furtherance of our methods of government? What if they weren't trying to help things? What if they were trying to help themselves, right? What if they were spying on people's communications or sharing them for monetary gain, or that they were actually foreign intelligence agents or something like that? The fact that controls are so lax in an agency with so much power, so much capability, should concern everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Snowden. My question has to do with, earlier one of the questions mentioned that there's a surprising, possibly surprising level of unawareness of your name and your leaks in the US. And earlier we also touched upon the interest of in the contents of these leaks, about whether people would show up at events if the leaker wasn't a celebrity, somewhat of a celebrity. So I also noticed that even among people who are aware of the massive level of interception of information and communications, a sort of apathy towards the content of these leaks, despite their gravity. So I was wondering if you expected that sort of reaction to your leaks and why you think that is.
So I pretty famously talked to the journalists, for those who followed the story, and said I was pretty confident this was going to be a 3-day story. It was going to be on the front page, there was going to be reaction the next day, and then there was going to be some commentary the next day, and then they were going to move on. Nobody's going to be talking about it anymore. The response that we have gotten has so far outpaced any reasonable expectations, right? There has been so much interest in this topic. There has been so much that people want to do to try to address these problems, real or perceived, in terms of the mass surveillance of the American people and, of course, those overseas to a much greater extent. Now, at the same time, what you read as apathy, I think it comes down to what is the origin of that? Because I don't think you're wrong in seeing that a lot of people, give a shrug at it. But I believe that's actually a feeling of disempowerment, that people don't actually feel they have any agency, any capability to change their circumstances in this regard, because we're talking about extraordinarily complex technical systems that are inaccessible in the most part to many laymen. And even for specialists, right? This is a very complex topic. And even if you can go, we can solve this issue or we can solve that issue, trying to solve everything comprehensively. So we can go, this is the goal, this is the policy, this is the plan, this is how we fix it. Feels like it's unreachably large for people who don't have their entire life to dedicate to it. And there are many people out there who are doing that. But I think the response that we should have here is to think about what you can do. And one of the most important things you can do is just talk about it. When you mention there are people that don't know about this, who are apathetic about it, think about what's really at stake here. Because it's not about surveillance, it's about rights. When people say, I don't care about privacy because I've got nothing to hide, they don't really understand what privacy is about. Privacy isn't about something to hide. Privacy is about something to protect. That thing, privacy, is the right to the self, right? Privacy is what allows you to decide what it is you believe, what it is you think about. Freedom of speech doesn't have much meaning unless you have the freedom and space to think. Freedom of religion doesn't mean anything unless you have the freedom from prejudice, from outside forces, right? The space within yourself to decide what it is that you truly want to worship. Even when we get down into the language of private property, you cannot have a claim to yourself unless there is a right to the self. Otherwise, you're simply entirely subject to the whims of the collective. Saying that you don't care about privacy because you don't have anything to hide is no different than saying you don't care about freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. It is the most fundamentally antisocial thing I can think about, because even if you honestly did not need it, and many people who are in positions of privilege, positions of power, really don't, because the authorities are never going to come after them. They're who the authorities are there to support. They're who the authorities are there to protect. But if you are a minority, if you are a little bit different in any way, if you are a little bit radical, or you dissent in any way against the prerogatives or the privileges of people in the most power, rights are for you. If you want to have them, you better stand up and defend them.
Thank you, and thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you.
On that eloquent note, we have run out of time. Please join me in thanking Mr. Snowden, particularly, particularly because, in fact, we did not pay him to join us today.
Thank you.
Morning or afternoon. One of the critical missions of the Institute of Politics is to provide a forum for the discussion of pressing issues of the day. And this certainly qualifies. Whatever you think about Edward Snowden and his actions, and the adjectives range from traitor to hero, he is indisputably triggered a really vital public debate about how we strike a balance between civil liberties and security. And so we're looking forward to this discussion today, and there's no one better to lead it than our own Professor Jeff Stone, who has spent a lot of time thinking and writing about these issues and served on the President's panel after the revelations of Edward Snowden to think through next steps and how to deal with the questions that were raised. Another pressing issue today, as it was 50 years ago, is the issue of civil rights in our country. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's campaign in Chicago. And we are going to have an event on May 19th with some of those who participated in that event with Dr. King and some civil rights leaders of this day to talk about what happened then and to assess where we are today. So we urge you to attend that. Let's see. Oh, that's going to be at the Chicago Theological Seminary, right? Chicago Theological Seminary. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the introducer, Brock Huebner, a fourth-year student and a stalwart of the Institute of Politics. So we appreciate him a lot. Brock.
The documents leaked by Edward Snowden in 2013 exposed a massive National Security Agency program gathering vast troves of call records and internet data, both internationally and among U.S. citizens. Since these revelations, there have been few individuals more discussed and debated, praised by some, pilloried by others. Though accused of espionage by the U.S. government and labeled a traitor by U.S. intelligence officials, Mr. Snowden has also been praised as a patriot and whistleblower, finishing as runner-up in Time's 2013 Person of the Year award. Through his actions, Edward Snowden forced a conversation about the relationship between privacy and security, not only within the upper echelons of U.S. government, but also on online comment boards, day-to-day conversations, and on college campuses like the University of Chicago. Indeed, this was Snowden's ultimate goal, claiming in an interview with the Washington Post's Barton Gellman, quote, "I didn't want to change society. I wanted to give society a chance to determine if it should change itself." Already the subject of an Academy Award-winning documentary, Citizen4, his story will receive the cinematic treatment in Oliver Stone's upcoming film, Snowden. Leading this discussion is Jeffrey Stone, the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor here at the law school. Professor Stone served on President Obama's review group on intelligence and communications technologies. He also chaired the University of Chicago's Committee on Freedom of Expression. Please join me in welcoming Edward Snowden and Jeffrey Stone.
Hello, Chicago.
So welcome to the University of Chicago. It's good to see you again. I should tell members of the audience that we will have time for questions, so you should be thinking of questions as we proceed in our conversation. So to begin with, maybe a bit of biographical background would be useful. How did you get involved in the national security realm? What is it that led you to be interested in this? And how did you find this to be something that was a passion of yours?
So I grew up for most of my adolescence in the, sorry, there's a little challenge with the audio. It doesn't appear to be gated, so we're getting feedback through some mic and I'm hearing myself. But I'll do my best to talk through it. I come from sort of a federal family. My father worked 30 years in the military. My grandfather retired as an admiral. My mother worked for the federal courts, still does. In fact, a point of irony that I have not overlooked. And when I moved to Maryland, about, say, the end of elementary school, middle school, I was in the suburbs surrounding Fort Meade. So like everyone else who eventually starts going through high school and college and looking at, what are they going to do? I saw that this was just the natural direction of my life. Now, I had always been really interested in technology, or shall I say, sort of naturally proficient with technology. But I was really influenced by the claims of government, by sort of the mythology that's grown up around our country, and of course, Hollywood. So I thought, in the midst of the lead up to the Iraq War, when so many other Americans were protesting, I actually drank the Kool-Aid and I said, I'm going to sign up for the U.S. Army. Didn't go for the Air Force, didn't go for the Navy. I said, I want to try out for Special Forces. And they had a special program. It was very selective. You had to pass higher standards than you normally would at graduation of boot camp just to be selected for it. But I worked really hard and I got in. Now I got injured and I got pushed out. And that was a time where I really looked back and reflected on my life of what could I do? And the conversations that surrounded me were, well, you've already started on your security clearance because, of course, you enlisted in the military. So why don't you finish that up and go into technology contracting for the IC agencies? And that was where I went. I went to the CIA, where I first worked as a contractor. While I was there, I was sort of talent scouted by one of the government employees who said, would you like to go overseas? And I had been, again, looking for that. And it just felt like it was something that I could do. A lot of other people in the office were like, I don't want to go. It seems like a burden. It seems like it wouldn't be, the kind of life you want. But for me, why not? So I did that. I rolled over to being a staff employee at the Central Intelligence Agency. On my first day, I came in and I took the oath of service. Now, I will point out, it's not an oath of secrecy. In fact, no oath of secrecy exists within the CIA or the NSA. The oath of service is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's not a pledge of loyalty to the president, to an official, to a policy, or anything else. It's to defend the Constitution specifically, and not just against those outside, but also against those inside. But I didn't have any problems there. I went overseas. I served undercover for a number of years from a diplomatic platform. And then I came back and went back into contracting for the NSA now. And this was perhaps 2009, 2010, somewhere in there. And for a number of years, I worked, I worked for the NSA as a contractor in Japan for a number of years. Then I came back to the United States. I worked for Dell as the lead technologist for their CIA account, designing sort of supercomputers for building password cracking clusters and things like that. And then I rolled over to Hawaii after I developed epilepsy and was no longer permitted to drive in Maryland. And there, I really began to be exposed to a scope of surveillance that I hadn't seen earlier in my career. There had been things that made me concerned, but particularly with the election of President Barack Obama and his claims to really roll back some of the most extensive policies that we saw during the Bush era, I thought, he should be given a chance. And it was with growing concern in these last years at the National Security Agency, particularly when I rolled over in my final position to working directly with the tools of mass surveillance. Although I wasn't working terrorism, I was working counter cyber. That I saw that our public claims had become entirely divorced from the private realities of how things work in the intelligence services in the United States. And that, I would say, is really how the arc of my career in full began.
So you mentioned that when you joined the CIA position that there was not a requirement or an oath of confidentiality. But I assume when you took the NSA position, like other contractors or employees, you were required to acknowledge the fact that you had an obligation not to disclose any classified information to persons not authorized to receive it, and were aware of the fact that there's federal law prohibiting that. So
I'm glad that you brought that up, because the thing here is that, yes, you are asked when you join the CIA as well, and of course the U.S. military as well, if you gain access to classified information, you're required by this policy to safeguard it, and of course by some federal laws. However, it's a civil agreement, literally just a standard bureaucratic form like all of the others you fill out when you're being brought onboarded to these agencies. There are many of them, called SF-312. It's literally a standard form that the government makes everyone sign. So yes, of course, I recognized the importance of it, as did everyone else I worked with. This is a critical thing. We don't want people just taking all the classified they have and throwing it up in the air and just saying, it'll all sort out in the end. That is a very valid concern. At the same time, it is not an oath. And this is where we start to get into the challenges. What happens when your obligations that the government has itself asked you to take upon yourself are in conflict with themselves? Do you obey the oath of service or the standard form 312?
So you reached a point clearly where you concluded that despite the fact that there are, as you acknowledge, federal laws prohibiting the disclosure of classified information to persons unauthorized to receive it, that it was the right thing to do to make a fairly large amount of classified information public. So I'm curious, what led you to the conclusion that was the right thing to do, and who did you consult in making that decision?
Well, I think it's the critical thing when we start to get into this is setting out the context. Now, I wasn't new to the intelligence community. I'd been working in it for 8 years before I came public. Actually, I believe more than 8 years. And the thing here is that over time, particularly in the Obama